Now, I'll show you one experiment and then a result of a meta-analysis that looked at the impacts of replacing sulfate sources of zinc, copper, and manganese with hydroxychloride. In this particular experiment conducted in the Netherlands, the goal here was to look at digestibility of nutrients. This was a Latin square, a 4x4 Latin square, in which all cows, as expected, receive all treatments. And the treatments were 100% of the supplemental trace minerals originated from sulfate sources. It's what's called STM 100. 100% originating from hydroxychloride trace minerals. Or then a combination of a mixture of sulfate and organic trace minerals, 70-30, or hydroxychloride organic trace minerals, also 70-30. So the authors here looked at the effects of this source of trace minerals, and then they compared the effects of HTM, which is the average of these two treatments here, the HTM 100 and the HTM 70 OT 330, versus the average of these two here. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. Obviously, this is a Latin square, and trace minerals have storage sites in the body. So it's unlikely you're going to have changes in metabolism of the animal by supplying such a short-term type of experiment, because there will be storage in the liver and other sites that can release, for example, copper, for instance. Okay, so to no surprise, there were no differences in production performance, as we can see here. Dry matter intake did not differ. Milk yield, fat protein corrected milk did not differ. Fat yield or true protein yield did not differ. But the authors were interested in digestibility responses in the total tract. So they measure total tract apparent digestibility of nutrients. And what they observed was that the hydrox trace minerals, as we can see here, which is the average of the treatments 2 and 4, result in greater NDF digestibility than the sulfate trace minerals. So about 1.5 percentage units greater total tract digestibility. Okay, obviously, because this is total tract digestibility, we don't really necessarily know what happened in the rumen, where probably most of the differences are taking place. And we do know that whenever you alter digestibility in the rumen, there is some compensatory effect in the lower gut. So my interpretation is that probably this change in digestibility is 1.2, 1.3 percentage points increase in digestibility might have been slightly greater if they had measured rumen digestibility of NDF. So not long ago, a group from Michigan State University, Barry Bradford and colleagues, decide to look at the literature and evaluate the effects of replacing sulfate with hydroxy trace minerals on nutrient digestibility in bovine. So they compile data from experiments, randomized controlled experiments in which dairy or beef cattle were used. And to be part of the meta-analysis, they had a series of inclusion criteria. Obviously, the experiments had to properly identify the experimental unit, and they have to have measure digestibility of nutrients. So we're going to focus on fiber digestibility here, which was the main types of responses. They use mixed models, so we're not going to get into this detail unless somebody has a question. And they look at the effect size, meaning the difference between hydrox trace minerals relative to sulfate. So hydrox minus sulfate, that's the effect size and the standard error of that effect size. So here we have the number of comparisons. So the number of experiments was somewhat limited, but each experiment had more than 2 treatments. So let's say a sulfate and a hydrox trace minerals, but it may have a different levels, or in the example that I just showed you, a factorial arrangement in the previous experiment from the Netherlands. And they measure digestibility, and they evaluate the change in percentage points This is the effect size, the standard error, and here's the p-value. Every time you see a red color, it's because the p-value is small, so there is somewhat of a high strength against the null hypothesis. So we accept that treatments are not equal in this particular example. Therefore, there is a difference between them. In this case, digestibility of NDF in the total tract increased 1.5 percentage points, okay, in the 12 comparisons, and the effect was statistically significant. No other effects were observed as it's reported here. So getting close to a tendency here of a 0.5 percentage point increase in dry matter digestibility. So very likely most of the difference came from NDF digestion in the rumen that affect total tract, although in this particular meta-analysis, rumen digestibility was not assessed.